Welcome back, Paul Cripps from PK People Solutions. And look, why are you here today talking about our topic, which is employee retention? Email came into both of our inboxes recently from ELMO, not the little red little monster, the cute furry little monster, but ELMO. You're going to explain a bit more about who ELMO are
Correct.
And why we need to listen to them. But it had some alarming trends and snapshots of where the employment market is particularly for small and medium businesses. So we're going to tap into that. But welcome back. It's been a while.
It has.
It's okay. It's good to see you again. But look, who are ELMO and what is this report all about?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me back, Paul. Look, ELMO are effectively an HR system provider. They provide technology-based solutions to medium and to very large businesses and corporates as well. They released this report, which is actually a third annual report that came out a few weeks ago. And it does have some great snapshots. I was actually at the launch breakfast that they held in Sydney as well, and heard some of the, what I call the sound bites of some of the data that comes out, some of what is quite the horror story. And effectively their research comes from a very large, I can't remember the exact number now, but very, very large sample size over the last 12 months of people, generally speaking, in HR roles, but there could be other people within different parts of the business as well that answer these questions. And I think it's useful, though, not just for larger businesses. There's lots of lessons to learn here for small to medium-sized businesses as well. Because to be absolutely honest with you, from what I see, I look at some of the data that comes out here, and I think, well, actually, the same lessons, the same issues exist in all businesses, not just larger ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the issues still apply no matter how big the business is, but perhaps even it's more of an impact in a small, medium business where you don't have the diversity or the scale of your employees. You've only got, maybe in a lot of cases, 3 to 5 employees in a typical small business. So the impact of losing an employee can be, I guess, a lot more devastating to a small business.
Absolutely right, particularly with somebody that's highly valued. If you lose one person and 20% of your workforce, which is only one person, that can have a big impact. And the cost of losing that person could be something which is high, and I tend to often use data like the cost of losing a good person could be 1 times an annual salary, and some people think that's a very exaggerated number. However, I don't think it's that hard to really build it up to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's have a delve in at some of these snapshots, and then we will talk about what's the solution for a business owner. There's a couple of things that really jumped out at me as being alarming is that 1 in 4 employees are currently looking for a new role.
That's an alarming stat, and I think it talks a lot to. Look, there is an argument out there, and a conversation I had about 20 or so years ago of some of the people in some industries are always looking for what comes next, but I think that's still very high. I think particularly in an environment where we know that people have moved on for various reasons, and we all heard a few years ago about the Great Resignation race and the impact that had. And to be fair, that's still in different words and different phrases, but that's still continuing in some form. Maybe not to the extent that it was, but certainly certainly there's a lot of people out there that are looking, which suggests, though, in terms of also what is the business doing to try and be proactive about that? Because being reactive, by the time you're reactive about it, effectively you're too late. So I think being proactive and understanding about how to retain good people is probably a better action than waiting for it to happen to you in your business.
Yeah, and look, the key to retaining people, the key about why we need to retain people, a couple of these other stats that have jumped out is the cost to hire being on average for a new employee jumping to $20,000. Now, I think you and I were talking about this before. We were saying that cost to hire doesn't include the lack of productivity as you're onboarding somebody. But $20,000 to hire a new person. In your experience, is that pretty much
I think that's obviously the research says what it says, right? But I'm not going to argue that research. It's an exceptionally good report. I think it's the careful thing with that research is quite safe for is that's just the cost to hire. That's not the lost opportunity cost and the cost it takes to upskill somebody to be fully effective in the role. That's purely the hiring cost if you delve into that statistic. And look, I would say it's a good stat in terms of people understand, well, actually, it's a lot better to actually keep some are good people rather than think about having to go out to market. But to me, that number, whilst some people might think it's alarming, actually, as I say, it's probably, in some ways, it could be misunderstood, and also, in some ways, the real cost is actually a lot higher than that $20,000.
Yeah, well, you mentioned earlier the real cost being somewhere up to $100,000 potentially, because that's the cost to hire somebody, but you may have a period where you don't have somebody.
Correct. That's right.
And look, the number of people out there actively looking for work, it may take some time to hire. And then we factor in, we won't talk about onboarding just yet, but if we factor in this next statistic, which I found absolutely staggering, is that about 13% of people resign or leave before the end of their probationary period.
And when I went to breakfast, that was the most shocking statistic for me, because that was a lot higher than I would have expected. Sorry, I should be the one that's better at maths than I am, but so it's 13%. Well, that's
about one in eight.
1 in 8. That's
one
right.
in 8.
Yeah, 1 in 8 is 12.5, right?
Yeah,
that'd be the numbers. So yeah, that's very high, and I think that's. And to be fair, you could argue then, well, actually, if you think about it, you've got you combine it with the previous statistic in terms of the cost to hire, and 1 in 8 is leaving this first 6 months. Then, well, you've got that cost twice per annum if we sort of like. Work on the numbers there. So so I think that does and that could talk to me in terms of how good the hiring process is, but also then in terms of how good is the onboarding and orientation that's taking place there, because that would suggest that and whilst there is always a competitive market and people out there looking for new things, it's alarming when you think that probably I'm thinking back how many years ago now, it could be talking 20 years ago. It would have been seen alarming to leave within 2 years of employment. And now we've got 1 in 8 people leaving within 6 months. Yeah,
well, perhaps even a shorter period than that. But the other thing, when you combine that, so the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman, and I'm pretty sure this statistic came from them, is that on average, an employee is changing roles every 17 months, which it really makes it hard for an employee. So coming back to our topic for today, the need for retaining your key employees. So, well, I think we've established it's a key step that we have to do.
I think we can safely say that retention of key employees is not something that people would argue is not an important step. I think the question is always how and what action should be taken. And look, and it can depend as well in terms of the size of the business. So I would say that there are actions that are good to take in a smaller sized business, but as that business grows to more a medium sized business, probably there'll be different ways of looking in terms of strategies to put in place to try and retain the best people.
Yeah. So how do you actually? What sort of things should you be putting in place? What are some of the strategies that are working for businesses that have a good track record of retaining their employees?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of it comes down to effective communication. I think is one of those things. It's an old buzzword, but I think a lot of it's also down to that communication that takes place between employee and manager. So having managers that can have effective conversations with people to, in some ways, to effectively make sure they're onboarded correctly, or once they're even through that 6 month danger period that seems to be out there, making sure that they're checking in with them and making sure they're going well in their role, enjoying what they're doing, and they have an understanding about what the challenges are, what comes next. And I think the key thing, I use a lot as well, it's about making sure the employees are aligned. And it's something which, it's language I've used for a number of years. I've used it on a number of other podcasts, but I always go back to the fact that, probably the highest feature of employee engagement I find is under measured at times, actually how aligned the employee is to the strategy of that particular business.
And look, I guess that's pretty subjective in terms of how you actually measure that. Like, how do you measure that somebody is actually aligned? I think we've all heard about these employee surveys, which sort of feel a bit off the mark with some of the questions. But is there a way of measuring how somebody is aligned with your business?
Well, look, a survey is one way of doing it, but I think a survey coupled with good practice conversations to actually. So yes, whilst you can survey, people can always necessarily answer a survey how they want to answer it, and may not necessarily always be truthful. Although I would always argue it's good to be truthful in those, but employers going out and asking for feedback, and we've got people that are working for employers or employers that are giving surveys, I would always say it's important to encourage honest feedback. But I think if they're not covering the survey, I think the measure is harder. But I certainly think the tactic should be a conversation to take place around really getting an understanding in terms of, a manager really should be working on making sure that they've got good understanding about, is this person really in some ways performing how they need to do? Because in some ways, if they're performing as needed and they seem motivated, then that's going to be a good measure to give some steps to show that they're actually aligned to the business and where they're going. And I find sometimes that part of the problem actually is sometimes our employers aren't always articulating enough what their strategy is and getting people on board. So I think sometimes, too often, I find probably it's the opposite way around. The employers aren't actually communicating their strategy well enough to their people that are working for them.
So I'm just thinking there that perhaps the problem with employees not being aligned actually starts at the hiring stage. That if you're hiring and you're not able to communicate the values and the strategy and what's expected of that role, if you don't communicate that clearly, then there's a very high chance that you're going to hire the wrong person, which leads to the resignation within the probation period or the turnover very quickly because they'll start looking for somewhere else.
Absolutely right. No, totally agree.
Okay. So if we get the right person on board, how do we improve engagement? Like we talked about communication and measuring that feedback. Back in my days as a junior employee, or even just initially as a manager, the role of you do these annual performance reviews, and everybody would basically treat them as a bit of a joke, because by the time you got to 12 months. The problem had escalated, and look, a lot of employees were very sceptical that management and the business owners would actually take that feedback and do anything with it. It was more seen as the employer coming to the employee saying, these are the things you need to improve, not that two-way process of the employee giving feedback saying, hey, these things aren't working, or this really needs to be addressed.
And I think that's some of those downsides, I think, without doubt still exist. Where it seems to work well, it's where there's a regular conversation that takes place, and I think that and the conversation becomes a two-way conversation. Having a framework in place to make sure that there is actually a two-way conversation is the way to have those kind of performance conversations, and making sure that they're regular enough that if there is some kind of 6-month or 12-month review, that's not a chore in terms of all the regular. I suppose call it an operating rhythm in terms of there's a regular one-on-one that might take place monthly, and that might be for 30 minutes. Anything that's a summary is purely a summary of what's happened, and there really should be no surprises in terms of feedback, but it also needs to be two-way as well. I often find that one of the things I've struggled with over the years is to try and talk to employers around, particularly when it comes to where an employee wants to develop. I often argue that conversation about development is often bolted in as an afterthought to a performance conversation, whereas I actually think sometimes it's better as a completely separate conversation. And some of the tools that I use in my business are really making sure you're actually taking that process out of the performance conversation, and the conversation is purely focused on how someone wants to learn and how they want to be retained is a different conversation entirely. Because people will want to stay in the business and want to for different reasons, and sometimes that can be financial. Sometimes, quite often, it's not. Quite often there's a number of things. It might be how a person wants to learn in terms of how they want to be rewarded. So there's a whole number of different ways that that somebody may feel that they're actually the way they want to be treated, or to help retain them.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to be that in the past we've traditionally relied on these performance reviews at 6 to 12 month intervals. But really what we should be doing is having a set of structured conversations throughout the year on different topics. And I know you mentioned monthly. One of the feedbacks that I was given was actually having weekly reviews with your employees saying, look, this went really well last week. We noticed that you were having an issue with this last week. What can we do? Does it mean you need more training, or was it something you didn't understand.
Totally agree. And look at it from the role in the business, and actually even the longevity of someone in the business will determine in terms of what the right level of frequency of those meetings would be. But certainly that's a much more effective way, because I just call that, I would almost call that good management practice. And look, the review meeting could be just a summary of that, and well, from that, the most effective kind of conversations like that, they become more coaching conversations that the manager's holding, as opposed to looking at and focusing on purely giving feedback on performance.
Mm-hmm. And look, if you were doing those regular conversations, I guess you sort of taking away the fear factor of these annual performance reviews that exist.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely
they become less of a big issue. They're more of really, I guess, rubber stamping the conversations you've had throughout the year.
Absolutely right. And that's, to me, that's in terms of when I've seen it work effectively, that's how I've seen it work most effectively, when it's just seen as a summary. And equally, I think, as I said earlier on as well, I think actually sometimes when you take the developmental piece out of it as well, and you have that as a separate process, that can work effectively as well.
Yeah. So with the with that process, I'm thinking that looking at a lot of small, medium business owners, they're very good at their job, very good at their business.
Yep.
But they don't have a lot of these skills. They don't have, particularly, they don't have accounting skills, or maybe sales. They don't have the HR skills. So there's a bit of an aversion to having these types of conversations because they don't know how to do it. Now, what guidance can you give somebody like that?
Look, I think it reminds me of a conversation I was having a couple of hours ago, actually, when someone asked me to do it for them. And that doesn't work either, by the way, because going in and having a conversation for somebody when you don't know the business is not really going to work. But it's very much around, I think, giving them a bit of a very, very basic framework to follow and helping them try to understand their people more as well. I think the more they can have a good understanding of their people, that's something where I might go in, I might do a bit of work to understand in terms of, actually what helps retain this person in the business, in terms of where do they actually sit, and gives a bit of independent work to really try to help the business owner get the most out of their people. So look, when I say I don't go in and have the conversation, I have different conversations, but the idea is to set things up. So then they're in a situation where, okay, right, I know that person, I know a little bit more about them now. How can I make sure that they're performing well ongoing as well?
Because I guess it would be pretty intimidating for an employee to have somebody external coming in and handling those conversations.
Absolutely right.
I think you'd sort of be on the back foot straight away going, well, what's going on? What's wrong?
People automatically think they've done something wrong.
Yeah.
And equally, someone like myself going in and having that conversation, well, I don't know, I might know a little bit about the business, but I don't necessarily observe that person performing every day. So it's very difficult to actually, I think, it's impossible to go and do it for somebody. So my role often is to go in and I guess, help that process as opposed to actually making it go away, so to speak.
Yeah. And look, when you put those processes in place, I'm guessing that they just become a natural part of how you do your week.
Absolutely right. And I think that and some people are better having those conversations than others. And I think sometimes I find that people understanding their style and the way that the conversation style and all their I would say their personality profile they'll then start to think about, okay, well, how can I be more effective in these conversations, given my, for example, their personality style in terms of the way it is. But then it becomes a habit, and you put things in place so so these conversations are ones that happen regularly and effectively.
Okay, so the conversations, obviously, that's a great starting point. A conversation, though, without the follow-up action, that could be
correct,
just as damaging as the performance review process.
And as I say, it's very much a case of you're going to say you're going to do something, you've got to do it. So so I guess it's down to in terms of, because once I've had the conversation in terms of what's the follow-up, and that's sometimes where I can go in and I can help from the outside in terms of what comes next, in terms of what is that person looking for. If a business consultant themselves, fantastic, but sometimes they do need more help with that as well.
Mm-hmm. So in these conversations, is it sometimes a case that you shouldn't retain an employee?
Well, yes. I mean, there's always going to be scenarios where someone isn't performing effectively, or isn't the right kind of person to do the role. So there are scenarios like that we'll come across where the person's in the wrong place, and that obviously goes into a whole other area. But that's certainly, there's an argument to say, going back to that research as well, is that there's obviously a lot of people in there that aren't happy themselves in terms of that if they're looking for something else. And I'd almost say, from a business owner's point of view, if it's someone that shouldn't be there, you sort of want to win that 25% of people looking for another role, because that's a much easier outcome than going through a process to exit them from the business.
So just wrapping things up a little bit and just bring it back to those initial conversations. There's a lot of cost of not being able to retain your employees, and let's say if it's 1 in 4 employees that you look likely to lose, and it's a cost of $100,000, that's a big chunk in terms of profit for a small, or for any business, but for a small, medium business, that's a huge amount of profit. So if we put in place some strategy and method to keep these employees engaged, and I think we came up with, yes, surveys can be done, but I guess in a limited workforce, it's a bit harder to get some anonymity.
I know what you mean.
You know what I mean. It's a bit hard to say, to hide the fact of which employee is making which comment in the survey, but
and I tend to those tools I don't tend to use in small business. It's a conversation we had just a few hours ago was along those lines, in terms of I use a different process to get the feedback, but it's not honest. It doesn't have the level of confidentiality that a survey would to a larger business. But that's something I build in up front and say, look, the feedback you're going to give me now, that becomes visible. You want to talk to me, talk it out first of all, before I write something down or enter something to a system, then please do that first of all, and we can take it from there.
So those conversations, getting some help with the framework, getting some guidance about, I guess, what sort of questions you are and are not allowed to ask with the current rules.
That's right.
That would be really helpful. And then I guess that some of the benefits, I think the employee feels heard.
Yes, that's right.
There's a closer alignment between what the employee understands their role is and what the employer expects from the employee. And then I guess performance can be managed in terms of additional training where there's a skills gap, rectification where we're seeing errors occurring, and perhaps there's also maybe some other issues going on in the business that could be raised to the surface and not become toxic.
Absolutely right. And I guess it's things that those things can be gold in terms of actually trying to work out and find out what they are, so a business owner can work on them before it becomes an issue.
So I think what we're saying here, Paul, is that preventing your employees from leaving.
Correct. It's a much neater way to go than waiting for these statistics to happen to you. And I think a lot of people, when they heard about Great Resignation rates, thought what happened to me, it's not going to happen in my business. And I think it's fair enough to say it kind of swept all sorts of businesses throughout the country, because obviously it's something which started, I think, in the US and the UK, and we weren't protected from that.
No.
It come with us.
So the data is there. We know it. We've seen it in our own businesses. We've seen it happening to the businesses that we transact with, our suppliers, our customers. There's a lot to be said for retaining your workforce and looking after them and making sure that they are engaged and aligned with your business. It's very important to have them aligned on heading in the same direction as you would like for the business. Lots to be said from working on that now. If you're like most small business owners, you probably don't have the skill set to do that. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with your management abilities, but it's not your skill. This is the perfect time to have a conversation with somebody like Paul Cripps